Okay. Salam sejahtera and good morning to all. Greetings from University Malaysia Kelantan. I believe that everyone in this room has had a fulfilling breakfast and everyone is in excellent condition. Great. So I'd like to welcome our speaker and our fellow host, Dr. Christopher M. Joll, Research Fellow of Center of Excellence for Muslim Studies, Institute of Asian Studies from Chulalongkorn University, Bangkok. Associate Professor Dr. Raja Iskandar Raja Khalid, Dean of the Faculty of Creative Technology and Heritage, University Malaysia Kelantan. DS Dr. Muhammad Saifuddin bin Sulaiman, Head of Department of Heritage Studies, Faculty of Creative Technology and Heritage, University Malaysia Kelantan. Representative from Faculty for Language Studies and Human Development, University Malaysia Kelantan. Researcher, lecturers, students, and our dear participants. So before we move to our event, let us begin with Doa recitations led by Dr. Muhammad Saifuddin.
Okay, Al-Fatiha. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Allahumma akhrijni min zulumatil wahmi wa limni binuri fahmi. Allahumma aftah alayna abwaba rahmatika wanshur alayna khaza'ina uluminka birahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanah wa fil akhirati hasanah wa qina adzabannar. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam Muhammadin nabiyyi ummi wa ala alihi washabbihi wasallam. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad Saifuddin, for the Dua recitations. Before we delve into today's sharing sessions, allow me to provide a brief introduction to our participants. Okay, Dr. Christopher M. Joll currently serves as a research fellow at the Center of Excellence for Muslim Studies, Institute of Asian Studies, Chulalongkorn University. He also holds the positions of adjunct research fellow at the Religious Studies Program, School of Social and Cultural Studies, Victoria University of Wellington, and the Institute of Ethnic Study, National University of Malaysia. Dr. Christopher earned his first degree in 1996, Bachelor of Horticulture from Massey University in Palmerston North, New Zealand. He continued his academic journey in Lake Lord College, Auckland, New Zealand, where he obtained a Bachelor of Divinity. In year 2009, he embarked on his PhD studies at the Institute of Malay Worlds and Civilizations, National University of Malaysia. His research focus primarily revolves around Thailand's expansive and diverse Muslim minorities. Dr. Christopher's interdisciplinary approach encompasses anthropology, linguistics, history, theology, and Islamic studies. Furthermore, his research spans inter-religious aspects, including Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism, and extends across transnational borders with a particular emphasis on Thailand and Muslim-majority Southeast Asia. With that, let us extend a warm welcome to Dr. Christopher for today's enlightening sessions.
Very good. Okay, well, I just want to again say how... Okay, let's start again. Okay, so Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And as we would say in New Zealand, g'day. It's not just Australians that say that. So lovely to be here. Lovely to put a face to the name of the esteemed Dr. Raja Iskandar, so whose work I've read and enjoyed interacting with. You might need to remind me, when do I need to finish speaking? Let's just do the housekeeping. Who is keeping time and who will kind of run their finger under their throat or hold a gun to their head? Who is keeping time and how many minutes have I got?
Approximately approximately an hour.
Okay, fine. So I will finish at 11.
And after
Okay.
that, we'll have a Q&A.
Wonderful. Okay, good. So, and if you think that I have lost track of time and it's now time for midday prayers, maybe tell me to stop talking. Okay, so and I'm enjoying presenting what I prepared, but I'm also very much enjoying interacting with your comments. So the title of this talk is Anglo-Siamese Competitive Colonialisms. And the making of Siam's Southern Malay minority. So we're going to be bouncing around, thinking about what the census data that we're aware of available to us has tells us about these dynamics. I'm going to be bouncing between demographic data and cartographic data. And before I kind of tell you a bit about my objectives, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about the story behind the scholarship. I think that it is, as an anthropologist, I have no interest in pretending that I am some sort of fly on the wall, that there is a perspective from nowhere. I kind of talk to myself about not being a fly on the wall, but a very ugly fly in the ointment, if you know the English expression. We sometimes leave our ointment open and at night a fly has died in the middle of the beautiful white clean ointment. So I wanted to tell you a bit about the story behind the scholarship. I don't know whether you are aware here of the New Books Network podcast series. There's new books in Southeast Asian studies, there's new books in Islamic studies, there's new books in ethnomusicology, and they interview the authors of recently published monographs. And what they do, the first question that they ask is, it is a person question. Tell us about how you began to be involved in this field. What led you to write this book? And I do think that I find it interesting to hear about people's stories before I hear about their scholarship. And so with that in mind, why don't we jump in? Okay, so the most important part of the story is that I have lived in South Thailand. I've lived in Thailand for 10 years, for 20 years, sorry. And for the first 10 years, I lived in Patani, and I shifted to Patani in the year 2000. It was July 2000. And I taught English at a private language school for 4 years before going on and doing my PhD at University of Bangkok. And this April, we will be, many of us will be aware that it is now 20 years since the security situation in southern Thailand dramatically decreased and violence erupted. And I was living there at the time. And so you may or may not need to be reminded that over the last 20 years, there's been over 7,000 deaths, and there have been approximately 21,000 injuries in addition to those 7,000 fatalities. That is a lot of orphans. That's a lot of widows. And so that is the first. And we lived in Jabitiko. I'm going to be talking about Jabitiko and Patani and the connections between Jabitiko and Kelantan soon. But we were living there when the things degraded, and particularly in 2007, you'll see there that the fourth bar in is 2007. That was when things got particularly bad with, drive-by shootings in town, bombings in town, and we were experiencing all of these. And so that made me very aware that there was something going on. Having said that, I have avoided for almost 20 years getting a reputation of someone who is primarily a conflict studies specialist. I am deeply concerned about the commitment of conflict studies specialists to be doing long-term, embedded, slow research. Now, quite frankly, I would love their money. I mean, if you want to get funded, then go and say that you're going to, you know, uncover some kind of transnational jihadi connections and all the rest. If you want to get funded, if that's your bottom line, then what a great career decision. But for a number of reasons, I didn't go down that track, not the least of which, and I'll be talking about this today, I think that there are lots of reasons why we should be aware and not naive about how difficult it is to turn the Titanic. That is the first part of the story. The second part of the story is related to, so my research portfolio is, I wrote a book and a monograph series published by Springer, and that was Muslim merit making in Thailand's far south. And that kind of symbolizes the end of my first chapter of my formation as a scholar. And it's, I always enjoy coming to Malaysia, and I owe an enormous debt of gratitude to the careful supervision at Alam Damadun dan Dunia Melayu at University Kebangsaan Malaysia under the tutelage of Prof. Shamsul and Prof. Wanzawawi Ibrahim from Terengganu. They both supervised me, and when I've turned up, I knew absolutely nothing. And so 10 years in 10 years in South Thailand. That finished with finishing my PhD and then publishing my book. But there's another part of my personal story which I think is very important for me to mention before we go in to talk about this idea of competitive colonialisms and the relationships between the Siamese, who the Thais were called at the time, and the British competition about the peninsula, particularly the this part of the peninsula, present-day Terengganu, Kelantan, Kedah, Perlis, Patani, the former Patani state, Joll. And that is this. I am a New Zealander. Now, I have been shortlisted, I'm very proud to say, I have been shortlisted on the Worst New Zealander of the Year award. Okay, so I am probably one of the worst New Zealanders there are because I haven't lived in the country for 20 years. And so we had to go back. We decided, we didn't have to, but we decided that it would be best to see out the pandemic in our own country. And so we did that. And so after 20 years in Thailand, our time was cut short. We'd made retirement plans. We had bought the Rua Golet that we were going to do up, and we were going to turn it into a houseboat. No, I'm just joking. But we went back to New Zealand. And so one of the challenges that we've faced over the last 4 years being based in New Zealand is learning how to be a New Zealander again. And trying to get beyond, I can't go up the road and get a teh tarik at 5 in the morning, and there's no roti canai, and I really miss the nasi grabu that we used to get. So this has been a good opportunity for us to learn about the history of our country. So my grandfather, during the Depression, he took all of his family, he had 5 kids, and he took his family all the way up to a very, very isolated part of the North Island called the East Coast. It's kind of like Hulu Bahan, there's nothing there. It was jungle, and he was a share milker. He milked cows for someone else, and he shot deer in the forest to feed his family. He grew his own vegetables, and he drank the milk. And he worked for a farmer who had been a soldier in the First World War. And if you were a Pākehā, if you were a European and you worked and if you served your country in the First World War, after you came back from the First World War, you were given land. This is back, you know, in the First World War. Okay. So one of the things that I've been doing as I've tried to be a better New Zealander, as I've tried to spend more time thinking about this thing called the Treaty of Waitangi. Now, the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand is our country's founding document, and it is was signed in 1840. It was signed between the Crown and a confederation of Maori chiefs, talking about areas of sovereignty, areas of autonomy, amongst other things. This is not the forum to talk about all the details of the Treaty of Waitangi, but there was a treaty. Now that treaty was broken. So I'm from a settler society, and I'm speaking to you in a country that has a different history, but we are cousins in the sense that we live in a place that was impacted by 19th century British colonial expansion that had a number, that has had and continues to have a legacy. And there were some developments in New Zealand in the 1980s and the 1990s. And very briefly, this led to what was called the Treaty of Waitangi Tribunal, where Maori tribes that that the Crown had acted unjustly towards were able to put a claim into a tribunal where professional historians would go into the archives and reconstruct what actually happened. Often these tribunal claims are about the loss of land. Now I'm going to just segue back. Why did I mention that my grandfather was a share milker to a return soldier in the middle of nowhere up in the top of the North Island in the 1930s when the Depression came? It's this. Maori soldiers who fought for the Crown weren't given land. Pākehā soldiers were given land that was Maori land. So in the past, before I began to do a bit more work on my own family history, I was proud my family lived as an ethnic minority. So at that time, you know, they were the only Ogepute in the kampung. They were the only Ogepute budak in the scholar. Yeah. And I used to say, oh, that is wonderful. Isn't it great? I come from a family that is not, as we say in New Zealand, in Thailand, high society, polo club, cricket club, badminton club, private school. We were down and dirty. So now I'm kind of thinking, well, that story is an indication of the legacy of colonialism. Now, we all have families, and we all have families that have done good things and done not so good things. We live in a country that has done good things and not so good things. But what I like about the tribunal, the Waitangi Tribunal, is the importance of historians being put to work, not to be living in the past, but to be saying, this is what has happened in the past, and this is how it's got to us here in the present. How, therefore, what must we move forward? And this is the big problem with the way that conflict studies and security studies is done. Many of them are completely historically illiterate. Not all, but they don't see the importance of the past on the present. When we tell the truth, this government during this period under this governor acted badly in this way, and it led to these unintended results to Indigenous people in this way. So I'm going to be talking about so the legacy of colonialism in the peninsula, specifically in Kelantan, because I'm in Kelantan. Now, I am not a Kelantanese expert. Okay, so I know more about Kelantan because I've lived in Patani than people in Bangkok and Chiang Mai and all the rest. But it's a tremendous privilege to be here, but it's possible that I'm going to say some things which you kind of think, not quite right. But I'm going to be developing some ideas of a scholar, and a very, very impressive scholar, Tamara Luce. And she published a monograph, and it's called Subject Siam, Family, Law and Colonial Modernity in Thailand. And one of her main arguments is that the Siamese took the policies of the British post 1857 Indian Mutiny of indirect rule, of separation, of leaving issues of adat and ugama in the hands of the Raja, of being involved, putting advisors into the court. So indirect rule, avoidance of conflict. And she very persuasively argues that the Siamese, particularly King Chulalongkorn, and I'll be talking a bit about him, from Bangkok, outdid the British in modernizing parts of the peninsula that they had influence on in ways that outdid them. So they outdid the British in their own job. So this is a concept that comes from her, not me. And whenever we quote someone, it's just polite, to differentiate between what we have said and what others have. Okay, so what I'm going to do very, very briefly, in ways that kind of are informed by where I'm sharing this, I'm going to be just talking very, very briefly about developments on the peninsula between 1786 and 1874. I've chosen this period because it begins with the signing of, with Francis Light signing the lease from the Raja of Kedah for Pulau Penang. And in the same year, there was something very significant that happened on the peninsula, on the east coast, and that was that the Siamese, under the leadership of the first ruler of the Jakri dynasty, and apologies for the yellow, you may not be able to see it from here, but Rama the First, Ramanung, who reigned from 1782 to 1809, he led a campaign that pushed the Burmese out of the peninsula on both the east and the west coast, and he came down and he punished Patani and other Raja who refused to send troops to assist the defense of the Utia. And so this was time for payback. So one of the ways that I like to do history is to be talking about connections. And we need to consider that there is a need to be smashing silos. The Malay studies silo, the Thai studies silo, the anthropological silo, the historical silo, the East Coast silo, and the West Coast silo. I only know the East Coast, but we all know how different the East Coast is from the West. So, and again, related to this, to be talking about how what the British were doing in the 19th century, late 18th century, 19th century, were responded to by the Siamese. So there were a number of things that happened between 1786 and 1874. And you know some of these developments. I'm not going to be talking about all of the pieces of the puzzle because we haven't got time to do so, but you will see that there is mention on the bottom there of the series of Siamese kings, and you'll see that there have been developments in the organization by the British of the colonies. We've got the East India Company being followed by the British Straits Settlements, etc., etc. You should know this, I'm sure you do, and if you don't, I will help you keep your secret. In the top, we've got some developments which are important. We've got a series of wars, 5 wars between 1786 and about 1838, where the Siamese really did subjugate Malays on the East Coast, particularly the Raja of Kedah, as well as Patani. And we know some of these developments. There were Burmese that came down in at the end of the Ayutthaya period. They came back in 1801. There is a famous account of this that I'll be talking about in the next slide. But I've included the date of 1841 for a reason, and that is the date. The 1841 is the date where the Siamese reinstated the Sultan of Kedah after 20 years in exile, and he appointed a new Sultan in Patani, and I'm going to be talking about that. Let's just go on. You will see here my reference to a number of books. We've talked about getting beyond silos. There's a remarkable scholar called Cyril Skinner, an Australian guy. Now, just because he is an Australian, we shouldn't be saying bad things about him. I mean, as a New Zealander, I'm obliged to say bad things about Australians. That may help me get out of the worst New Zealander of the Year award. Okay, so if you're wanting to know about the wars in Patani between 1786 and 1832, Francis Bradley's Forging Islamic Power, published by University of Hawaii Press, is an absolute must-read. Now, Dr. Raja, if you haven't got this monograph in your library, you need to have it. An excellent piece of work looking at the legacy of Sheikh Dawda al-Patani. So now Skinner has written, he has transcribed and translated the Shair written about the invasion of Jung Silong of Phuket. It's written by a member of the court in Kedah. He's written and he's transcribed and translated an extensive account by one of the secretaries of the third king of the Chakri dynasty while the invasion of Kedah in the 1830s was happening. But he's also, and this is the reason for really mentioning it, he also wrote a very compelling account of the civil war in Kelantan in the 1840s. So you'll see that this table is intended to kind of bring into dialogue some of the things that the Siamese were doing on the peninsula between 1786 and 1841, and the developments by the British, the lease of Pulau Pinang, acquisition of Province Wesley, and the Anglo-Dutch Treaty, and the signing of the Burney Treaty in 1826. In 1855, another agreement emphasizing free trade. This is what it was all about. It was we don't want your land, we want trade, we want security of trade, we want freedom of trade. And so these developments went on and off over the first half of the 19th century, that led to a time that the general position is, particularly amongst Thai scholars, and there may be some Malay scholars that would like to contest this claim, but after all of the violence of the invasions, of the taking of thousands of prisoners, Malay prisoners, from the peninsula to Bangkok to build all of those canals in Bangkok, after all of that carnage, after all of the campaigns, after all of the internally displaced people. So there's a table there. You may not be able to see it. So it shows the changes in the number of Malays in Province Wesley between 1812 and 1842. So in 1812, there were almost 10,000 Malays in Province Wesley. In 1820, there were 14. In 1833, there were 60,000 Malays counted by the British in Province Wesley. Now, this is an indication of the level of violence and dislocation that was happening in that part of the peninsula. So going back to the whole thing of the Treaty of Waitangi, we cannot move forward in the future if we are not talking about what actually happened. You know, the dramatic events in South Africa. There was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission led by a remarkable man of faith, Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, where people who killed, assassinated, tortured black activists, white activists working against apartheid, they came back, and in a court of law, they said what they did. I took him and I tied up his hands and I kicked him to the ground and I blew his brains out. And looking at the family saying, and I want to say that I apologize. There is nothing that I can do to excuse my behavior. And there is enormous power. The problem with a lot of the way that we think about conflict is that many of us take a very impersonal, bureaucratic approach to how we are going to bring about change. And we basically think it's someone else's job, right? And I want to say how deeply skeptical I am about that kind of thinking. I think that we need to emphasize on the things that ordinary people can be doing. And this is my, as an historian, one of my contributions. Apologies for inappropriate passion in what should be a very sober scholarly presentation. So there are a number of maps of the peninsula. I'm going to be showing you these maps. And this map is a British map, and it says, you may not be able to read it there, and apologies if it's too small. But there are no political boundaries on the peninsula here. And it's written that south is Perak and Terengganu, tributary to Siam, has been written. So this is a map from the 19th century. And these campaigns that I talked about were under the leadership of the third king, Ramasam, who died in 1851. And he was succeeded by Ramasi. Now, the reason why this is important, 1841, the Raja of Kedah gets to go back to Kedah. And in 1841, there was a resolution to the civil war in Kelantan. Now, how was this revolution? How did this resolution come about? And this is very, very interesting and very, very important. The various tribal chiefs who were contending against the succession of the new Raja, who did they call on to resolve this dispute? They called on Bangkok. They called on Raja Siam, or Raja Siye, as we would say here. And so there was recently the death of the Raja in Patani, and at this stage the old Istana, which we can imagine was in a very poor state because this was 1940. This was less than 10 years after the last entry of Siamese troops in present-day Patani. And so the Raja in Bangkok was aware that one of his vassals had passed away. And so he proposed that one of the people contending the succession in Kelantan was taken to Patani, and he would be made king. So this was an intervention of Siam, which gives us an indication that, if people in Kelantan were asking Siam to kind of resolve and bring an end to this violence, this, there are some legitimate claims that Siam had some sort of authority. Now, this was brought out of violence. Okay, So, and this person, and he was called Tengku Besar. So he was the first Raja in the Jabetiko dynasty that ended with the Tengku Abdul Qadir Kamarudin, and we'll be talking about him at the end. And he shifted the capital from Bana near Gresset, from there, and he shifted it to a part of the river about 4 kilometers from the Kuala of Sungai Patani, and that became a community called Jabetiko, and I lived in that community for 10 years, so I always enjoy talking about Jabetiko, and that was the start of the last lineage in the history of the Kerajaan Patani. And that's, I hope you found that is interesting to interact with as I've enjoyed preparing. Now, there are some other interesting anecdotes, documentary evidence of the ways that the 4th king in the present Chakri dynasty, Mongko, he wrote to President Franklin Pierce, President of the United States, on the 12th of April, 1856, and he referred to himself as the King of Siam, and he included most of the Malay Peninsula in southern and southern western, and he talked about other groups, the Lao and people in Cambodia. So a few years later, King Chulalongkorn, who we'll be talking about soon, he's the 5th king in this reign. He died in 1910, and he wrote to the Ottoman Sultan, and he referred to himself as the King of Siam, both northern and southern, and all of the dependencies, Laos, Malays, Karen, etc., etc. Now, I've included this coat of arms, and I want us to just look up there. You'll see at the bottom left-hand side of both of these. Okay, so on the left, there's on the left-hand side, there is something which is pink background, and it has 2 gris. And these symbolize, this is the coat of arms for Siam, used by Chulalongkorn in the late 19th century, from about 1878, I think, till he died in 1910, and he understood very much that he was the king of the Malays as well. So that's part of the story. The other part of the story, and we won't have time to deal with all of the details, what I've done over the last few months is I've been working on a series of articles, series of talks that will form the basis of a series of working papers, that will form the basis of a series of articles that will eventually be a book. Dr. Iskander, Raja Iskander will know about the importance of of having, more than one piece of output, from any one piece. Yes. So I think it's been an interesting exercise for me to be, as I've been thinking about this idea of competitive colonialisms, to be paying attention to a number of dynamics. You may have heard that governments come and go. You may be aware that there are good governments and bad governments headed by good presidents and not so good presidents. And what I've done here is on the left, I've got the series of governors of the Straits Settlements from 1826 through till about 1910, which corresponds to 1910 being when Chulalongkorn passed away. And there were a number of governors, and some of those governors were adamantly, rabidly anti-Siamese. There were others, particularly Harry Ord and Clark, who were more moderate. And the governors of the Straits Settlements were working under the colonial office. So the different branches of government, and there was at some stage, I won't go into all the details, there was a differentiation between the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office, and the Foreign Office had officials up in Bangkok who were representing London, not Singapore. So Singapore was Colonial Office, so it moved from Penang to Singapore, Colonial Office. These need to be understood to be different from a series of officials who were appointed by the Foreign Office to work in the consulate in Bangkok. And I'll be telling a few stories that include some of these people. And so again, some of the officials, the British officials in Bangkok, some of them were very, very supportive of Siam, and others were quietly persuaded by the Colonial Office that with a bit more effort, we could change some opinion and get away with a few things. So this is the landscape that we are working in. We're working in a landscape where British colonial rule of the peninsula is changing. We're changing from Penang to Singapore. There's a change between pre-1857, the Indian Mutiny, and post 1857. There are things that happened before the signing of the treaty in Perak in 1874, and I've got a number of incidents there. So we're looking at the period between 1826, which was the Burney Treaty, which negotiated free trade, that was developed in the Burney Treaty in 1855, that ended in 1909 with the Siamese, Anglo-Siamese Treaty. So this is, let's jot down a bit more about some of the things that were happening. So we've dealt with some of the developments along the peninsula up until 1874. So after that time, I'm arguing that there was a period best described as the decades of increasingly competitive colonialisms as King Chulalongkorn in Bangkok sought to respond to increasing British and French influence in the region. And these influences were increasing in the south, that impacted parts of the peninsula that his predecessors had established control of, but also to his northwest with the arrival of the British and British Burma. And again, this happened in the 1820s. And then in the 1850s, the French began to take territory in parts of Indochina, present day Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia. And so this set off these decades of what I call competitive colonialisms. Now, we haven't got the time to talk about all of the details of the things that happened, but there were increasing visits of King Chulalongkorn down to Kelantan and Terengganu. And here are some pictures of taken by Siamese photographers in Kuala Terengganu, as well as in Kota Baru here. There were reforms of his administration, the Tesabiban reforms in 1892. There was, after an incident where the French came with gunboats to the Chao Phraya River in Bangkok, there was the loss of territory and the signing of a treaty with the French in 1893. There was an agreement between the French and the British in 1897 because they didn't want to have a border where British territory and French territory were up against each other. And so they saw the Siamese as providing a buffer, and we'll talk a bit about that later, and I could go on. And so this map here, wait a minute, I need to press that again. This map here gives you an idea of some of the changes in South Thailand, the way it was organized. And so there was this new administrative system called a monton. And the first developments involved on the east coast, Nakhon Tamarat, Monton Nakhon Tamarat, going all the way down from Nakhon Tamarat down to Patani. In 1906, Patani became its own Monton. On the east coast, on the west coast, Monton Phuket was established in 1894, and that the southern border of that was the northern border of Kedah, which was included present-day Satoon. And so there's been a reconfiguration of British and French influence, but inside the country, Chulalongkorn decided, if we're going to survive, we have to modernize. We have to not give the British or the French the excuse that we are unable to organize our own affairs. And so there was a remarkable secret agreement between the British and the Siamese in 1897. And this signed an agreement that said that no other foreign European power will be given permission to trade and will be given concessions to land south of a point of the peninsula in present-day Prachuap Khiri Khan province. And that is the narrowest part of the peninsula opposite the Burmese province of Tenasserim. And this was a secret agreement. And remarkably, we see in maps of the peninsula, we see the writing of the British sphere of influence beginning to appear on maps of the peninsula produced specifically by the British. And we see these particularly in British colonial atlases. And this is an indication to the secret convention that actually the Foreign Office didn't tell the Colonial Office in Singapore about. And so we have this time when the Singapore people, the Chamber of Commerce in Singapore are talking with the Colonial Office. We want to get concessions. We want to do this. We want to do that. And the Foreign Office in London wouldn't tell them this is not going to happen. So in New Zealand, we like to make the joke. The answer is yes. Yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, maybe you're familiar with that. So I just want to tell the story and give a bit of a shout out and a plug to a remarkable book. It's a piece of historic fiction, so it's not a diary, but the great granddaughter of Tengku Mahmud. Let's start again. Of Tengku Abdul Qadir Kamaruddin, who was the last Sultan of Patani. His great-granddaughter has written a piece of historic fiction in the form of an imagined diary that the last Sultan of Patani kept. And it provides, she does an exceptionally good job of imagining. She's read all the literature. And so on specific dates, there are things that happen. And she reconstructs and imagines the interactions between the last Sultan of Patani. Remember the Jabetiko dynasty that was established as a resolution of the civil war in Kelantan, about his interactions with Chulalongkorn, about his conflicts with the Siamese state as they were beginning to modernize, as with the passing of his father, Sultan Suleiman, he was not immediately made Raja, despite the fact that he was Raja Muda, the loss of income from his salt mines, his inability to take custom taxes at the river customs office, and we could go on and on and on. And there were a number of interactions between Sir Frank Swinningham and a number of Raja, particularly of Legeh, of Talupe, and of Patani. So there is an interesting set of primary sources and secondary sources based on these that talk about the negotiations between traditional Malay Raja who are being squeezed And for a while, Sir Frank Swinningham was very, very keen to help. And what actually happened is that these three, particularly these three Raja, they appealed to Frank Swinningham, would you please come and help us against Siam? One of these Raja, I think it's the Raja of Kedah, he sent a gold cross to King Edward in London via the colonial office in Bangkok and colonial office in Singapore, asking for him to come under his protection. Isn't that a remarkable story? A Malay Raja in the late 19th century sends the King of England a gold cross with an appeal for help. And that is one of the many, many anecdotes about this period of competitive colonialism. So the top picture here is a picture of Chulalongkorn in Singapore. I think it's from, is it from 1885? I can't remember. Apologies for that lack of detail. And the bottom picture I'm sure that you're aware of is a picture taken at the signing of the Anglo-Siamese Treaty, where Terengganu, Kelantan, parts of Kelantan, parts of Kedah, Berlis were reconfigured, and we know about the details of this. So I want to just briefly summarize. These are some of the justifications that were given for the annexation of the peninsula by the British, and one of them was connecting the Straits Settlements with the British colonies in India via the west coast ports. So on the west coast, we've got deep water ports. On the east coast, they're more shallow, they're more sandy, and obviously they're not across the Bay of Bengal. There was an interest in achieving political stability. There was also, so for a while, the bottom line from the British was we want free trade. And I would argue this developed a bit later on. Not only do we want free trade, but we want free land. We know you're not going to give it to us, so we'll pay you for a concession. But we know historically, concessions made in the 19th century often eventually never ended. Colonialization, not by the gun, but by the pen. There was also a development, there were people wanting to see parts of Malaya, parts of Malay sultanates under some sort of British protection being linked up to British Burma. And particularly in the late 19th century and early 20th century, before 1909 treaty, there was a lot of talk in the sources about the British claiming they had a responsibility for protecting the Malays against the Siamese. So this is classically paternalistic colonial thinking, and I get a bit cringy when I read this stuff, and it's really quite remarkable. We have enormous esteem amongst the Malays, and we must take our responsibility to protect the Malays against the Siamese seriously. If we don't do so, our respect will go down. So, but there were spoilers and there were sponsors with these plans to annex the peninsula. For instance, there was a disagreement. There was a lot of energy and initiative on behalf of the merchants working for the various private companies and the East India Company, the Straits Settlements, that wasn't shared by all of the bureaucrats. I've mentioned before, but it's important to reiterate. The Colonial Office and the Foreign Office were not on the same page, and it's important when we are thinking, and this is very, very common, what bureaucrats are happy to do is trying to get, the reason why bureaucrats don't change light bulbs is that, they can't agree on something so simple. And also there was, as well as initiatives from the British to annex the peninsula, There are a number of examples, and I've restricted myself to between ending at 1909, but some of the invitations of the British to annex part of the peninsula, traditionally under Siamese control, were at the specific request of local Malay leaders. So all of these are important. Let me just briefly mention to you some of the ways that the British justified annexation. For example, you will see in some colonial atlases, I'll speed up because I'm almost out of time. You'll see a deliberate misdrawing of the boundaries of southern British Burma. This is an intentional miswriting, misrepresentation. So you'll see there, the Tenasserim is not the bottom of Phuket. So the pink section on the left is Phuket. So this atlas claims that British territory on the western coast of the peninsula went all the way down to Phuket. You'll also see that there are colours used to indicate areas of Siamese, the presence of Siamese, of Buddhists, and of Malays. So in this map, we've got green and orange. There are a number of maps that change the British portion of the Malay portion of the peninsula. So you'll see here, I've got a number of maps, and you'll see that although the Malay portion of the peninsula is in different colours, they are far up the peninsula, and they butt right up against British Burma. Now, the British don't have the monopoly on cartographic craftiness and mapping mischief. So this is a map, an Archinese map of the peninsula, of Sumatra, of Java, of Sulawesi, and of Borneo, of Kalimantan. Okay? Now you'll notice a number of things. What do you notice there? You'll notice the size of Sumatra in comparison to all of the other parts of the region. So this is a piece of propaganda from Aceh, sending this map to accompany a letter to the Ottoman Sultan. Please come and help us get the Dutch off our back. And not only that, they claim that Patani, Kelantan, Terengganu, Kedah, they are all subject to Aceh, which, I hate to say this, was not the case. So that's not to excuse British mapping mischief, but we all do that. We all misrepresent reality. But I really, the title of this talk has to do with the making of Thailand's Malay minority. And I think it's very important that we remind ourselves that before 1909, on the peninsula, part of Siam, before it was shrunk and modernized and lost territory, there were at least 1 million Malays who were subjects to the king in Siam. So 1 million. So I've analyzed a number of census. And so, for example, I've got a census data from 1903 that talk about the total number of Malays, a large number. I've got other census from 1908, and I've got another census of Monton Phuket from 1917. For example, Phuket, Monton Phuket, basically from the north of Kedah all the way up to southern Burma, 30% of the population of that Monton were Malays. 30%, including in Panga, so the mainland opposite Phuket, it was 30% Malay. Phuket in 1917 was 15% Malay. This was a large number. So this is the result of some analysis that I've done. So there is census data in Siam that counts the number of Malays in Siam in 1911. And we also have data from about the number of Malays in Terengganu, in Kelantan, in Perlis, and in Kedah. Now, it's a bit complicated because Satun was part of Kedah, so it gets a bit complicated. But basically, what this tells us is that before the Anglo-Siamese Treaty of 1909, Malays there were 1 million Malays in Siam at the signing of the 1909 Anglo-Siamese Treaty, and that represents 12% of the population. In Monton Patani in 1908, it represented 5% of the population. I mean, this is so why this is important is this helps explain that we can map out the distribution of Muslim minorities in Thailand in a number of ways. And what I want to do very briefly, starting from the map at the right on the way down, we will see in central Thailand significant Muslim minorities. So approximately 20% of the national registered mosques in Thailand are located in central Thailand, Ayutthaya, east of Bangkok, and in Bangkok. Now, why this is important is that the vast majority of these mosques are in communities that are descended from Malay prisoners of war that were relocated by the Siamese beginning in 1786 until 1830s. Now, Elias's family, they've got some, they've got communities in Bangkok where we see the continuation of distinctively Malay practices. And this is a very, very important, I've written about this in an article in the Indonesian and Malay World. But as we come down, there are significant Malay minorities on the east and the west coast north of Patani. And this does not negate the importance of Patani Yala Naratiwat being clearly Malay majority provinces, Songkhla and Satun just under the majority. So this is the story about how this part of the peninsula remained within Siam. It remained in Siam because of a number of decades of aggressive, rapid modernization, combating British plans to annex the peninsula. These are some of the things that happened. We have no idea about how things would be if Sir Frank Swinningham had been successful in negotiating that the graduate and the Patani states, the 7 Patani states, Nongchik, Patani, Yala, Raman, Yaring, Legeh, Tanpe, they came under British sovereignty. We have no idea about how things would have been. But I think the other reason why I really am interested in presenting this series of talks is that this case study reminds us of the importance of history in the drawings of boundaries and of the making of minorities. And I'm referring to what's going on in Palestine. We all know the history of Palestine, the disagreements between American geopolitical interests and British geopolitical interests, and these resemble, these happened in the 1940s. These developments happened in 1919, but these dynamics were revisited after the Second World War. That will be the topic of another talk. But I look forward to your comments and questions. And I think I've gone over time, and I want to apologise for just slightly not calibrating that. So I'll hand this over to the chair.
No worries. Thank you very much, Dr. Christopher. Oh, I mean, you may continue. I mean,
No. I think I've done more than enough. Yeah.
Okay, let's see if we have any questions from our audience or our audience online. Okay.
I'll just get back to the start, and I can go to the slides that are of interest to people. Yeah. Any? Oh, what's happened there? That disappeared.
You can see it.
Of curiosity, why do they go to the British and the French, not the Russian? I'm not really good at history, by the way, to ask for help.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay. So the primary sources. So there's been the archival sources, the paper trail created by Sir Frank Swinningham, and that have been analysed by others. There's others in the Colonial Office and the Foreign Office that have analysed the correspondence between Sir Frank Swinningham and particularly Tinku, I've got a mind blank now, Abdul Qadir Gamarudin. There were a number of interactions, and Duff recommended to the Sultan that he hire a lawyer, and he made some threats that if the British were willing to help him, that he would go and contact another foreign power. And the assumption is that he was most likely referring to the Americans. Yeah, so the Americans had signed a deal. So the Americans, like others, were kind of prevented to have any kind of commercial presence in the peninsula. But he specifically made, so there were the Russians, the Russians, the Germans. So the French were, so you can't, you know, he kind of hoped that if he had risen up in the south, that the French would kind of cause problems on the northeast. But most people think that his threat to involve another power was more likely to be the Americans than the Russians. But the British were certainly adamantly anti-French colonial presence. They didn't want to be sharing borders. That had the Napoleon Wars. German companies were wanting concessions and being involved in the cutting of a new canal to compete with Singapore, but also the Americans were specifically mentioned. And this was 1900, 1901, 1902. By 1902, it was game over. He was arrested for subordination because he was considered to be a civil servant by that stage. Yeah. Good question, though. I don't know why we can't see this on the screen, but maybe we don't have to worry about that. It was too much information. Yeah. Anyone else?
There's the questions from our audience.
Sure.
In what ways did economic factors such as trade and resources exploitation played a role in competitive colonialisms and their impact on Southern Thai Malay community?
Oh yeah, it's really interesting. So I'm in the process of finishing off my analysis of things. So there was syndicates. So there was all sorts of. There was a guy, a very famous merchant in Singapore. His name was Reed, and he was kind of an advisor to a syndicate of people because there was a development, you know, until about the 1850s. The concern was to negotiate with Siam, for the British to negotiate with Siam free trade. And then, as if we know Southeast Asian history, we know that you know, later on in the 19th century, the Japanese began to invade China. There were opium wars with China. A number of Western powers, colonial powers, were coming in, and they were signing off just millions of square kilometers of land as concessions, and concessions for mining. The same things were kind of happening in Britain. There were just people were taking land. So the emphasis changed from free trade to free land. And so, for example, there was, I can't remember the specific name, but it was something like the Malay Peninsula Development Syndicate. And this was, I've got debentures, I mean, you know, shares, you can find them on the internet. And what that was is French companies, engineers involved in the cutting of the Panama Canal were interested in doing something similar across the peninsula, and but they couldn't say that they were a French company, and so the company was registered in London, and it had something like 30% French ownership, but this company really needed the endorsement of the Foreign Office. And so there's a paper trail of people writing between London and Singapore and Bangkok about the credibility, the legitimacy of this company. And what it wanted to achieve was a concession over all of the peninsula, including Patani, to be able to build a canal, to be able to develop railways. And so, I mean, we read it, I mean, we read these interactions, this correspondence, the wheelings and dealings. You know, we can't say we're French because if we're French, the British aren't, the Foreign Office isn't going to support us. We have to talk about our English credentials, because if we do that, we've got the heir of that particular consul general, and his name is Sitao in London. I mean, remarkable kind of nefarious negotiations intended for, you know, motivated by people to be making just an enormous amount of money by getting at the top of the capitalist, the colonial capitalist pyramid. We know all about pyramid schemes and all the rest, but I think that it's sometimes helpful to boil down very complex developments over a number of decades to simple terms such as developments from negotiating free trade that respected sovereignty to wanting to negotiate free land, and you know, it's remarkable. I mean, you know, some of the consul generals, the British consul generals in Bangkok, just say, you know, I cannot believe that that London, no, that Singapore is wanting to try and get this past the Siamese. I mean, do they really think the Siamese are so dumb that they would hand over 20, 30 1,000 square kilometers of land? You're from Perak, you know all of the argy-bargy and the negotiations of surveying Hulu Perak. So there were British surveys that went through, at least 3. There were, you know, John McCarthy came through and surveyed. His first survey drew the Siamese line basically directly going east from the southern tip of Province Wesley, and it takes a bit of a dog leg up over into Kelantan. But you know, this was the time of high colonialism. This was before the First World War. By the First World War, the moral integrity of the British states, and what the war exposed about the you know, the impact, well, I would say the impact of the Enlightenment on the moral integrity of Europe. By that stage, things had began to crumble. Then there was the Depression, then there was the Second World War, and then it was all over. But this is the height of European, and we're particularly interested in British colonial expansion and along the peninsula. And just to emphasize, these went up and down, slow and fast, depending on who was in the Foreign Office in London and in Bangkok and who was leading the colonial office. And by far the most strident anti-Siamese person from Singapore was Sir Frank Swinningham. So he died as an old man, and he rewrote his history of Malaya in 1946. And even in 1946, he was saying we need to get Patani out from under the Siamese who allowed the Japanese to kind of build this railway where, you know, tens of thousands of allied troops. So he went to his death as someone adamantly anti-Siamese. That's a long answer.
I appreciate the answer. I mean, it is very insightful. We have another 3 questions from the Facebook Live. Okay, this question is from Shada Sharul. What's your view on the Islamic practiced by local communities in Southern Thai? What is your view on the Islamic practice by local community in Southern Thai, and how does the Islamic practice shaped by the colonialisms? Does the Islamic practice changes?
Okay, so I'm not really sure how that question is
Relevant.
is related to my talk. I mean, maybe she wants to know about what I think about, you know, invertebrate. No. So okay. I'm not really sure what's behind that, and I'm not sure how it's related to my talk. I'm not sure whether is this euphemistically by Islamic practice? Is she talking about religious practice? Is she talking about resistance against the political legitimacy of Bangkok now? I'm afraid if she wants to clarify in writing about what specifically she means, please do so, and I could perhaps respond to another question, but I'm afraid that's just a bit too broad and not immediately obvious about the connection between the talk. So apologies to the person asking the question, but maybe she could write a clarifying question while you put another one to me. Would that be okay?
I'll proceed with the next one.
Yeah.
What is the future of Malay Muslim majority in Southern Thailand? Is there any plan or special treatment from the government towards them in order to create stability between states?
Okay, so I don't think the issue is the stability between states. Okay, so I've made a number of comments about the level of dysfunction between the Colonial Office and the Foreign Office in the 19th century. Okay, we have the same thing going on within the Thai state. We have for a number of years, far too many years in my opinion, we've had most of the prime ministers in Thailand are generals, former generals. Okay, so next to Cambodia, Thailand has the largest number of generals in proportion to general enlisted people. So the problem we've got I think that most analysis of politics in Thailand acknowledge that given all the numbers of constitutions that we've had, all the coups that we've had a recent election, the party that won the popular vote wasn't able to form a government because of a line in the constitution that said that it had to be approved by the Senate that is elected, and they're mostly conservatives. So we have an army, a powerful army, but we've got more than one army. We've got 4 armies, okay? And then we've got a bureaucracy, and then we've got a monarchy, and then we've got the police, and all of these in one way, shape, or form are impacting on the ability to move forward in the south. for a number of reasons, some of which I can understand. If I'd seen governments come and go because of coups and the rewriting of constitutions, if I was a member of the BRN or Pulo or whoever, I would be kind of thinking, well, I'm not really sure who I'm negotiating with. So there is a need to, there is a need for some sort of clarity about who to negotiate with. So there are arguments, there are reasons why the BRN would want to say, I'm not really interested in negotiating with the government. I want to negotiate with the army, but you can't do that in Thailand because, you know, we're all pretending that the army isn't as powerful as it. Yeah, is there?
Sorry.
Yeah. That's all right. Okay, I'll put that back in. So, so on paper, there is. I don't believe, I wouldn't agree if anyone was sitting across from the table and said there is a problem of religious freedom in Thailand. If someone was to make that claim, I would ask them their reasons for making that claim, which is another way of saying I don't believe that that's the problem. That's not the problem. The problem is that Thailand has had, for a number of years, all ethnic and all linguistic minorities in Thailand have had to face the Bangkok bulldozer. Listen, we've got to have signs that we've got the passport in one language, we've got a curriculum in one language, and despite the fact that there are a number of large ethno-linguistic minorities, Thailand has Thailand has a checkered history of accommodating linguistic minorities. Now, what really is the issue in South Thailand? There is people will say, oh, well, it's poverty. You look at the number of incidences in South Thailand, you correlate it with the poorest parts of the province. That's not what's going on. You may say, well, actually, the problem is conflict between Buddhists and Muslims on the ground. Well, actually, no, because where the provinces, the districts where there are most Buddhists are not necessarily the place where we have the most incidences. What there is a correlation about is the most thoroughly Malay-speaking parts of the South are the places which have the strongest resistance, the strongest empathy, and either explicit or tacit support for those who are involved in violently challenging Bangkok's legitimacy. That's the correlation. So I would say, if anyone writes about transnational Islamic connections, transnational violent Islamic movements, I mean, I'd love to hear their data and to see their data, but I think they're way, way off the mark. This is primarily an ethno-linguistic dynamic that has led to violence. So, you know, immediately after the Second World War, initially, I'll be talking about this in Bangkok, initially people like Tunku Mahmud Mahiding wanted the British to come and annex the peninsula at his invitation. That didn't happen. The Malay emergency happened, and so Siam, Bangkok, and the British had to cooperate. And so the idea of the Patani states joining British Malaya, they were gone. And then we had Haji Sulong, who was campaigning after that had gone, campaigning on some sort of limited regional autonomy. After that, when that was unsuccessful, he was arrested, he was disappeared afterwards. Then we have the development of a separatist organization. So, if you read the sources, even as early as the 19th century, in the late 19th century, we have the half-brother of Chulalongkorn complaining, listen, we need to find officials, Siamese officials, to come and administer these Malay states. we can find people who speak English, but you can't find government officials. This is late 19th century. You can't get Siamese government officials to come down to Patani and learn Malay. So the policy is government officials must learn Malay. So we've got a source from 1908 saying if you, over 3 years, you pass Malay language tests in South Thailand, so this is from 1908, you will get a large bonus, despite the fact there is very little evidence I see of that being taken up. So, you know, there is such a thing as linguistic chauvinism. And if, you know, when the thing is that not only do separatist movements, when you have a large geographically concentrated linguistic and religious minority by virtue of their religious affiliation and their language allegiances, when they are different from the state, but that religious minority, that linguistic minority is geographically concentrated on the border of a nation state where there are Malay speaking Muslims in the majority. If you had some sort of weird ethno-religious, ethno-linguistic minority in the middle of the country, that's going to be a difficult resistance to kind of see successfully through. But when it's on the border like this, you don't get resolved by, and so there is enormous, most things happen, all things happen for more than one reason. And so it is too early to tell about what this government is going to do in terms of language policy. It's and I personally believe that one of the main areas is language policies. Listen, you can get funding for Islamic schools, you get government support for building mosques. There's all sorts of so if people are inclined to be suspicious against the state, they will see these things as opportunities for control. That may or may not be the case. As we all know from my talking about all of these different governors of the Colonial Office and the Foreign Office, we know that good people come and good people go, and bad people come and bad people go. So in New Zealand, we would joke about, everyone likes conspiracy theories, okay? So I kind of don't really like conspiracy theories. I like the cock-up theory. So things just someone messed up. Okay, so if you want to go for conspiracy theories, that's fine. I think it's the cock-up theory that explains what's going on. And in New Zealand, that language wouldn't be understood to be particularly rude. It's rustic, but it's not rude. But maybe I hope that I've answered that question. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, I'm not so sure if there's any improvement with the current governance where the central bank of this sense.
It's too early to tell.
It's too early to tell.
It's too early to tell.
Next question. It's to do with your research in Southern Thailand. How do you adapt to the local communities to understand the custom and heritage of the local people? While you are...
Yeah, I lived there for 10 years. I lived in Jabatiko for 10 years. I don't know. Who's been to Patani? Yeah, anyone been to Patani? Jabatiko, the old Istana, the Goto. So, I mean, I lived there for 10 years, and I initially learned Thai because my wife said, we can live anywhere, we can do anything as long as you learn Thai. So I learned Thai for the first 2 years, and then gitu waso gitu no ngaji logat taning baso tepate sebab kita makan roti pagi-pagi dengan sains-sains di rumah. Baso buah hati dah kalau kita tak ngerti nak ngaji. But so I don't speak standard Malay, and I never speak Malay when I go to KL because they all laugh at me. They say, "Oh, kampung, tagi kelate, you tak tahu gapo." I think, I mean, it's a very interesting. I mean, it's a fun story, but it's a bit odd. I mean, I was there in and out for 10 years in South Thailand. And since being in South Thailand for 10 years, after we shifted to Chiang Mai, I intentionally didn't do research, particularly in Japetiko. What I did is I did a multi-sited research in Ayutthaya and in Bangkok, and got Yao Noi near Phuket, and in Segogo and in Narathiwat, trying to compare the form of urban bilingual Malay negotiation with Thai modernity with Muslim communities from a Malay background in Ayutthaya, in Bangkok, Segogo, Phuket, and Narathiwat. Because one of the big problems about studying South Thailand is most people base their understanding of South Thailand on Patani. Now, Patani is a tiny, wee province. You know, Raman is huge, Ranget is huge, and people don't go into villages, and they don't. Well, there are many who speak Malay, and they go into villages. They are not unreasonably concerned about their security, but they're relatively few. And this is the big problem, that the number of monographs based on ethnographic research amongst rural Malay communities in South Thailand, I can count on one hand. What tends to happen is that people come and go, and they interview people in hotels in Patani, and no disrespect. I mean, if I could get funding to do a project like that, you know, and sit in the aircon and have a nice translated conversation with someone, and get another assistant to type up the interview, and I analyze that. I mean, that's great. Yeah, but so to answer the question, I mean, we're very, very. I understand that I'm a bit of an oddity and a bit of an anomaly by being able to live and work in Patani for 10 years, and then to be able to compare what I know about South Thailand in other parts of the country. But it is commitment to language learning. That's the most important thing. And it's also the willingness to take your time. So when I'm doing work on tarikat, on you know, ngatik besar, apa dia Idrisia, Naqshbandi, go, apa dia Badawiyah, Qadriya wa Naqshbandiya. So when I do that, I often just turn up, hopefully with a friend, but occasionally no one wants to come with me. And so I turn up and I just say, you know, maaf, kita punya gatot, di sini ada babo-babo, yo jadi mursyid, yo buat zikir besar, betul ke tak? And so I give them a card, give them the name of my Malay friends, and then I go off to the coffee shop, and they get on the phone to my Malay friends and say, who the hell is this? There's this random kind of Oge Puteh, this Mat Saleh who's turned up. Who the hell is he? What's he going on? And they say, oh, Soba. No, it's okay. So Chris looks scary, but he's not. He's a New Zealander, and he's coming to do research. So that willingness to go and to do field work and to take your time. So it is my preferred practice that I would visit people just 2 or 3 times, introducing myself, and then when I kind of sense that that they're interested, that, I mean, if they don't want to cooperate with me, that's up to them. It's all about consent. It's all about consent. But if they do, then, you know, to begin to say, well, these are the kind of questions that I'd like to have answered, and maybe we could think about coming back again, and then, you know, maybe take the camera, take some photos, video footage. Can I please record our conversation? And then my experience is that, and Elias has taken me around many people. After a while, everyone is very, very happy to talk to someone who has demonstrated by their actions that they're respectful, that they listen well. And so those are the main things: taking your time, learning local language, and equally importantly, working with local researchers. I never refer to people as my research assistants. I talk to them about being my research collaborators. And I think that the distinction between the two is great. Now, if I was just funded to the hilt by some rich kind of well-endowed funder, I mean, I have no problem. I mean, I'd ring up, Dr. Raja Iskandar. Listen, I'll pay you 100 ringgit a day. Just, 1,000 ringgit a day. You just name your price. Come with me. I mean, if I had the money, I'd probably be tempted to do that. But there's stuff that you come across when you take your time, when you go slow, when you work with others. That's been my experience, and that's the model that I would advocate. So, I mean, I'm pretty useless at writing fat cat kind of research grants, and I mean, I don't know how to do that. This is all I know how to do, and that's the big dirty secret. I only do this because this is the only way I know how to work.
Well, I appreciate the answer. I guess what Dr. Christopher trying to deliver is always humble yourself while you are collecting data on site and treat your fellow samples or candidates respectfully. Okay, we still have a couple of questions over here.
Yeah.
This is a quick one. Have you published this material as a book or journal article? If so, can we have access? I believe Doctor have mentioned a couple of publications you've made via Springer. Is there other materials?
Okay, so the easiest thing to do is to go on to academia.edu or ResearchGate, and then to just search for Christopher M. Joll, and I think ResearchGate, I'm Chris Joll. Made that mistake. If I call myself Christopher M. Joll, it sounds frightfully scholarly. Chris Joll's a bit too short, who wants to have one syllable when you can have two or three? So go on to academia.edu, search my name, and everything that I've published is there. And my latest post is about the Muslims in Thailand bibliography project. And that is a project that we just launched in Patani at Prince of Songkhla University on last Friday. And on that is a series of bibliographies, including and a link to a Google Drive with some of the works freely available. But all of my publications are freely available on academia.edu. Yeah. And if you want anything else, just email me. I think there's this thing called the interwebs. So you can search on the interwebs, and yeah.
Do check out the ResearchGate of Dr. Christopher. We have the next questions.
Yeah.
The Siamese claim that Patani and Joll has too many Siamese settlers by 1909 to include these territories in the treaty. Is it legitimate?
Okay, so the number, what we've got, data-wise, what I'm doing is I'm doing more work on looking at primary data from Siamese sources, and I'm not talking about Tom Yum source or satay source. We're talking about the stuff that is written, available in a range of Siamese archives. We're in the process of analysing a census that so far hasn't been analysed by anyone, and that's of Monthon Patani in 1908. And I'm going to be presenting a paper at University Kebangsaan at Kajian Institute Kajian Ethnic, University Kebangsaan Malaysia. Maybe I can provide you or Dr. Raja Iskandar with the link to the Facebook Live or the Zoom meeting, and I'll be presenting that material. So there was, as is often the case, it's like, the Malaysian government encouraging Malays from West Malaysia to go and work in East Malaysia. I mean, this is just something that governments do. And so and we know about the widespread phenomenon in Indonesia of Javanese being sent to parts of Indonesia, particularly under Suharto, to there are a number of reasons for doing that. So we are probably not yet in the position of being able to track all of the changes in the ethnic composition of parts of present-day Patani, Yala and Naratiwa. But what we do know is that in as early as after the Second World War, there was a series of settlement of kind of, it was called the Nikum projects. And you may know this. So the government wanted to make use of land in all over the peninsula because it was very underpopulated. But this is important. What they did is they actually deliberately recruited Thai Buddhists from Kelantan to go and they could buy very cheaply land that they could farm. They would give these Thai Buddhists dual citizenship, Malaysian and Thai, and these would travel between Kelantan and South Thailand. Now, why is this interesting and important? So in other parts of the peninsula, we've got people, poor Siamese Thais from the northeast, give them land in the south. And so there's work done by ethno-linguists on the presence of Lao and Isan speaking people in the peninsula. We don't see actually many of those in Malay majority provinces in the south. What we do see, you may be aware that the Thai Buddhists here speak a dialect of Thai called Jehe that comes from Daba. Because there's some old temples in Daba. There's some old temples on this side of the Golok River. And many of these communities have been here since the Ayutthaya period. They speak Malay as well as Thai, and the Thai they speak is Jehe. And so social linguists have actually studied the distribution of Jehe speaking communities in the south. Now, what's significant about this is that, and again, it goes back to what I say about language. Many of these Thais were in communities that established in the past, built temples, they used existing temples and they used other temples, but they were bilingual speaking Thais. Again, this goes back to the fact that in terms of drivers of conflict, it is language, not religion, that drives conflict. If we are from different religious traditions, or we have changed our religious allegiance, conversion can take, all I have to do in the right company, I have to say a certain phrase in the right company, and that can be used as evidence, and I'm no longer a Buddhist or a Christian, I'm a Muslim. But this issue of language is far more complex. It takes years, unless you're a genius. I mean, maybe you're a genius, I certainly am. It took me years of hard work to learn not just one, but two languages. But when you lose a language, that language is almost always, unless there is an enormous amount of effort, going to be lost forever. So language loss, and linguistic minorities know this. They know that, you know, if we don't speak Malay in the house, and if we don't turn off the Thai television and tune into, you know, the television from Kelantan, if we don't have Malay music in the house, our kids are going to grow up Siamese. And why is this important? If we don't teach our kids to speak Malay, very, very soon, when God, inshallah, if God gives us kids, our children will not be able to speak with their grandparents. And if our children can't speak with their grandparents, they can't stay with them, and they aren't going to be passed on all of the oral traditions and the cultural traditions, and they are going to be not orphans, but they are going to be deprived of access to an enormous part of their cultural heritage. So the issue of the presence of Siamese communities in the South, these did increase between the 1960s, 70s, 80s and 90s. And I might add, since the violence, they have gone down. So there's been a reduction in the number of Siamese, of ethnically Thai Buddhist communities in the South since 2004. And having said that, what has also happened is that middle-class Malays who have been educated in Thai schools, particularly those living, working for the government and living in rural communities, they have left and they have gone to other Thai-speaking provinces. And so we see in some parts of Krabi, in some parts of Drang, some parts of Songkhla, Hadyai, large numbers of Malays who used to live in the south have left because of that. At the same time, those who are poorer have not had the opportunity to shift south as such shift north because they don't have good enough Thai. What they do is they either stay in these communities affected by violence, or they are forced to go and live in Malaysia, where often they work as illegals in a very tenuous way. So, but we'll be talking about the influence of conflict on the changing of the ethnic composition of these provinces tomorrow at University Kebangsaan. Apologies for the long answer. Yeah.
From the for 1 hour, the point that very clear. Assalamualaikum. For 1 hour, there's 2 points that you very clear that you say. First, about the treaty of the treaty in
Yeah, Treaty of Waitangi, yeah.
the tribunal in South Africa.
Yeah.
What can I personally ask? What's your advice for Malaysian here to take from? What can we learn from that?
Okay, good. Okay, so I'm not here to be your friend. Sorry, I'm not here to be your friend. I actually think that Indonesia has got a lot more expertise in solving their problems with misguided, with religiously motivated violence. I think Indonesia, every time I go to Indonesia, I am incredibly impressed by the collective wisdom of Muslim leaders who have worked through the chaos of the Suharto era. So I'm not in a position of influence, but despite the fact that I'm in Kelantan in Malaysia, I actually think that there are people better qualified to be in leading the peace negotiation. I'm an anarchist. I'm enormously suspicious about the ability of institutions run by the state to do the right thing. And I think that I believe that violence, and the research shows that conflicts that have been resolved through aggressive, non-violent action historically are more successful than resolutions that have been brought about through violence, because the simple reason is this: violence is traumatizing for both those perpetrating the violence and those who are victims of violence. So the data shows this. So as people of faith, every religious tradition has ways of justifying violence under certain conditions, and absolutely, and including Buddhism. So the phenomenon of resurgent anti-Islamic Buddhism in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, these are dynamics that I assume that you're all aware of. So all of us have got our skeletons in our closet. And so I am in control of very few things. These are the things that I am in control of. I'm in control of what I think. I'm in control of what I say. I'm in control of what I do. I'm not in control of what some general in Bangkok is doing, thinking, saying. I'm not in control of what the various leaders of the various organizations, based some of them in Malaysia, others in South Thailand, others in Indonesia, Bandung particularly. I'm not in control of what the BRN or Pulau or Mara Patani, I'm not in control of either of those. What I can do is I can say, I believe that there is the need for a prophetic, radical, faith-based, non-violent approach to a resolution, and that begins with the simple task of telling the truth, how we got to where we are. Yeah, so that's how I would answer. Yeah. Thanks for your question, though.
I guess that's all sums up the sharing session for today, because we are close to 12 noon. Before we end the session, we'd like to invite the Deans of Faculty, Creative Technology and Heritage, PM Dr. Raja, to deliver a token to our distinguished speaker.
Get some token. It's customary here. It's really nice to meet you. Okay. Yeah. Yes, sure. Yeah, but yeah. Get the cheers out of the way. Oh, that's good. Oh, I'd love to. Oh, we have oh, yeah.
Tadi kita have a meeting with tadi kan.
Yeah. Oh, okay, macam you'll take a photo.
For the sharing session today by Dr. Christopher M. Joll from University of Chulalongkorn. Before we end the session, we'd like to invite all participants to come forward to have a group photo.